What if I told you that some of the most careful arguments for the resurrection of Jesus don't begin with the Bible being inspired, or with faith, or with any theological assumption at all? What if they begin with history? Hello, my name is Joshua Mkaiwa. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we'll be looking at one of the most discussed arguments in contemporary historical scholarship, the minimal facts argument for the resurrection of Jesus. This is an argument developed by scholars like Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. Now, whether you are a committed Christian, a curious skeptic, or somewhere in between, I want to walk you through this argument as fairly and as rigorously as I can. We're looking at the evidence, looking at the objections, and then you can get to decide what to make of it. Let's get into it. So, what exactly is the minimal facts argument? Here's the core idea. When historians investigate ancient events, they don't get to demand certainty. They work with what they have, ancient documents, corroborating sources, archaeological evidence, and then they reason toward the most probable explanation. The minimal facts argument, or the MFA, applies that same historical method to the question of Jesus' resurrection. But it comes with an important constraint. It only uses facts that meet two criteria. First, the facts must be strongly supported by historical evidence. Second, and this is what makes the argument so unusual, they must be accepted by the vast majority of critical New Testament scholars, including skeptics, agnostics, and non-Christians, not just believers. That last criterion matters enormously. When a skeptical historian concedes a fact about Jesus, it carries a different weight than when a believer asserts it. The argument was pioneered by Dr. Gary Habermas of Liberty University, who has spent decades cataloging and analyzing the academic literature on the resurrection, over 3,400 scholarly publications. His co-author, Dr. Michael Licona of Houston Baptist University, brought a rigorous historiographical framework to the argument in his landmark 2010 work, The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach. The point they both emphasize is this. No prior faith commitment is required to engage with this argument. We are doing history. So, what are the minimal facts? Habermas and Licona identify 5 core historical data points. 1. Jesus died by crucifixion. 2. His disciples had experiences they sincerely believed were post-mortem appearances of Jesus. 3. Paul, the former persecutor of Christians, converted after a claimed encounter with the risen Jesus. 4. James, Jesus' own brother, who had been a skeptic, converted and died for his belief. 5. The tomb in which Jesus was buried was found empty. Now, critics do dispute the 5th fact, the empty tomb. But even that is accepted by a strong majority of scholars. The first 4 are accepted so widely that even the most skeptical critical scholars generally concede them. Let's look at each one carefully. The first fact, Jesus died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, around AD 30 to 33. You might expect this to be controversial. It isn't. We have multiple independent ancient sources confirming the crucifixion, and crucially, several of them are non-Christian. Tacitus, the Roman historian writing around AD 116, records that a man called Christus was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the late 1st century, also refers to the execution of Jesus. We have references from Lucian of Samosata, from Mar Bar Serapion, and from, of course, all 4 canonical Gospels and Paul's letters. This convergence of independent sources, Jewish, Roman, and Christian, is why even the fiercest critics of Christianity accept the crucifixion as historical. Perhaps the most striking statement comes from John Dominic Crossan, one of the most skeptical Jesus scholars of the 20th century and a co-founder of the infamous Jesus Seminar. He wrote, and I quote, "The passion of Jesus is as historically certain as any event in antiquity." Let that sink in. A skeptic, someone who denies almost every supernatural claim about Jesus, considers the death by crucifixion one of the most historically secure facts of the ancient world. So, fact one is solid. Jesus died by crucifixion. That is our starting point. The second fact is more nuanced, and it's important to state it precisely. We are not claiming that Jesus actually rose from the dead. We are claiming something more historically modest. The disciples genuinely believed that they had seen Jesus alive after his death. They were not lying. They were not knowingly fabricating. They sincerely thought they had encountered the risen Jesus. How do we know this? Several reasons. First, there is the ancient creed embedded in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 3 through 7. This creed is extraordinary. Scholars date it to within 2 to 5 years of the crucifixion itself, possibly even earlier when Paul met with Peter and James in Jerusalem. That is not enough time for a legend to develop and displace eyewitness memory. In it, Paul lists the appearances to Peter, to the 12, then to more than 500 people at once, many of whom, Paul notes, are still alive, and then to James, and then to Paul himself. Second, we have multiple independent sources for these claims. Paul, Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, all attesting to their appearances from different angles. Third, and perhaps most powerfully, the disciples died for this belief. Now, people die for false beliefs all the time. That's not the point. The point is that people generally don't die for something they know to be false. The disciples weren't dying for a doctrine handed down to them. They were dying for their claim to have personally seen Jesus risen. That is a meaningful distinction. Fourth, there's a detail that historians find significant. The Jewish worldview of the first century did not anticipate a singular resurrection of a person in the middle of history. They expected a general resurrection at the end of history. This means the disciples had no theological template to project onto Jesus. Something unexpected appears to have happened that required a new framework to explain. Now we come to two of the most fascinating pieces of evidence, the conversions of Paul and James. Paul, known before his conversion as Saul of Tarsus, was not merely indifferent to Christianity, he was actively hostile. He approved of the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. He went house to house dragging Christians off to prison. He describes himself in his own letters as having been a persecutor of the church. Then something happened. Paul claims to have seen the risen Jesus, an event so overwhelming that it completely reversed the trajectory of his life. He went on to become the most prolific missionary in the early church, planting congregations across the Roman Empire, writing letters that would become scripture and eventually being executed for his faith in Rome around 64 AD. What explains this? The skeptic must propose a naturalistic account of why one of Christianity's most dangerous enemies became its most articulate champion, and is willing to die for that transformation. James presents an equally striking case. During Jesus' ministry, James is described in the Gospels as a skeptic. Mark records that Jesus' own family thought he had lost his mind. John tells us his brothers did not believe in him. James, the brother of Jesus, was one of those skeptics. After the crucifixion, something happened. James became a leader, a pillar in Paul's words of the Jerusalem church. Paul himself met with James, and the Jewish historian Josephus records that James was stoned to death around 62 AD for his faith in the risen Jesus, a martyrdom attested by a non-Christian source. Here's the question the historian must wrestle with. What does it take to convince someone's own brother that they have risen from the dead? Family members are typically the last people to be persuaded of miraculous claims about a sibling. The conversion of James from skeptic to martyr is one of the most underappreciated pieces of evidence in this debate. The fifth fact, the empty tomb, is one of the most debated of the five, but it is still accepted by a majority of critical scholars, roughly 75% according to Habermas's survey of the literature. Here's why historians find it compelling. Enemy attestation. Our earliest opponents of Christianity, Jewish religious leaders, did not deny that the tomb was empty. Instead, they claimed the disciples had stolen the body. This is recorded in Matthew's Gospel, and it's the kind of detail that has the ring of historical authenticity, because why invent the charge you're trying to refute? Crucially, the charge presupposes an empty tomb. Even the enemies admitted it was empty. The Jerusalem factor. The resurrection was proclaimed in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus had been publicly executed just weeks earlier. If the body was still in the tomb, opponents had every incentive and opportunity to produce it. They never did. The role of women. In all four gospel accounts, it is women who first discover the empty tomb. In the first century Jewish world, women's testimony was not generally accepted in legal contexts. This is exactly the kind of detail that a fabricator would change. The fact that women are named as the primary witnesses suggests that the tradition was reporting what exactly happened, rather than constructing an ideal narrative. Early dating. The burial tradition and the empty tomb are bound up with Paul's early creed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which, as we noted, may date to within a few years of the crucifixion. The window for legendary embellishment is extremely narrow. Taken together, these four lines of evidence make the empty tomb a historically robust datum, even for scholars who approach the text with significant skepticism. Now, a fair presentation demands that we take seriously the alternative explanations, and there are several. Number 1, the conspiracy theory. The disciples made it all up. This is perhaps the oldest objection, and one of the weakest historically. Multiple independent groups of people, not just the 12, but Paul, James, Mary Magdalene, the women, all corroborate the appearances. Conspiracies tend to fall apart under pressure, especially when the conspirators are being imprisoned and killed. And the disciples gained nothing materially from their claims. No wealth, no political power, in most cases, only suffering and death. Number 2, the hallucination of vision theory. The appearances were psychological experiences, not physical ones. This is more sophisticated and deserves a serious response. The problem is multifold. Mass multimodal hallucinations of 500 people simultaneously are not a recognized psychological phenomenon. Paul and James were not predisposed to see Jesus risen. They had no prior expectation that would prime such an experience. And crucially, visions do not explain the empty tomb. Even if every appearance was a subjective vision, we still need to account for the missing body. Number 3, the wrong tomb theory. The disciples went to the wrong tomb. This is rarely taken seriously in academic literature. Multiple individuals, the women, Joseph of Arimathea, the authorities who posted a guard, all knew where the tomb was. A wrong tomb error would have been trivially easy to correct. Number 4, the swoon theory. Jesus survived the crucifixion and later appeared to the disciples. Roman soldiers were professional executioners. The process of crucifixion, flogging, affixation, the final spear thrust confirmed by soldiers, was designed to ensure death. And even if Jesus had somehow survived in catastrophic physical condition, a barely alive man crawling out of a tomb would not have inspired the disciples' confident proclamation of a triumphant, glorified resurrection. As David Strauss himself, a 19th century skeptic, acknowledged, this theory fails on its own terms. Number 5, the legend theory. The resurrection stories developed over decades as a myth. This was fashionable in the 19th century, but modern scholarship has largely moved past it. The creed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 dates far too early for legend to have displaced eyewitness memory. We are not dealing with stories that developed centuries later. We are dealing with claims made by people who said, "I was there." No single alternative hypothesis accounts for all 5 facts simultaneously without requiring additional unsupported assumptions. That is the crux of the minimal facts argument. So, how does the resurrection hypothesis measure up? Michael O'Connor, drawing on the philosophy of history, applies a standard set of criteria historians use to evaluate competing explanations of data. The best historical hypothesis should have explanatory scope. It accounts for all the facts, not just one or some. Explanatory power. It makes the facts expected rather than surprising. Plausibility. It fits with what we know about the historical context. Non-ad hoc status. It doesn't require inventing unsupported assumptions. Illumination. It helps explain known historical phenomena. The resurrection hypothesis that God raised Jesus bodily from the dead satisfies all 5 criteria with respect to all 5 facts. It explains the empty tomb, the appearances, Paul's conversion, James's conversion, and the disciples' willingness to die. None of the naturalistic alternatives account for all 5 facts as elegantly or as economically. Now, I want to be transparent here. Whether you find this argument conclusive will depend partly on your prior assessment of whether miraculous events are even possible. Philosophers call this the question of background knowledge. If you begin with a firm prior that miracles cannot happen, no historical argument will overcome that prior. But here's what Habermas and Licona are actually claiming. Given the historical facts on the table, the resurrection is the best explanation. They're not asking you to abandon your critical faculties. They are asking you to apply them consistently. As New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, one of the most eminent historians of Christian origins, concluded after an 800-page historical study, the historian, when examining this subject, is confronted with an event of immense historical probability. Let me bring this together. 5 historical facts, considered by the majority of critical scholars across the theological spectrum. 1. Jesus died by crucifixion. 2. His disciples genuinely believed that they had seen him risen. 3. Paul, the persecutor, converted and died for it. 4. James, the skeptic brother, converted and died for it. 5. The tomb was empty. The minimal facts argument doesn't ask you to start with faith. It asks you to start with history. And it asks one straightforward question. What is the best explanation for all 5 of these facts taken together? For Habermas, Licona, Wright, and many other serious historians, you can add me to the mix, the answer is the bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. You may disagree, and that's fine. This is one of the most profound questions humanity has ever wrestled with, and it deserves careful, honest engagement rather than reflexive dismissal from any direction. If you want to go deeper, I'd recommend starting with Habermas and Licona's accessible book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, or Licona's more technical, The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach. For the skeptical response, you can check out Dale Allison's Resurrecting Jesus, which is a rigorous and honest engagement with the data from a more agnostic perspective. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this content useful or even beneficial, please do like, share with a friend, or even do consider subscribing. If you have a couple of questions or even objections, feel free to leave a comment. I'll be sure to engage with them. And of course, as always, Christianity is true. See you next time.